folks. Welcome to middle of February to our local history guild this evening. With our guest this evening is Gordon Calhoun, who's a curator at the Naval History and Heritage Command. Is that right, Gordon? That's right. And I'll tell you what this is all about. This is pretty great stuff. I'm working on this project, about the history of Yankee whaling in the U.S. Navy, which is it's a pretty engaging topic, and there's so many features to it. I mean, just running down the list, of George Claghorn of New Bedford and the building of the U.S. Constitution, and David Porter's cruise to the Pacific in the War of 1812, the mutiny on the Globe, Jeremiah Reynolds and the origins of the U.S. exploring expedition, Herman Melville and the USS United States, the Billy Budd and the Summers affair and the effect that had on the men in the whale fishery, the Matthew Perry's expedition to Japan, Matthew Fontaine Maury in the U.S. Hydrographic Office, and plus the sort of general patriotic feeling that Yankee whalemen had, and it turns up in their journal illustrations and Scrimshaw, and you see lots and lots of patriotic naval motifs and whatnot, and the Stone Fleet in the Civil War. And tonight we're going to hear about this fellow, this New Bedford native, William Pritchard Randall. Randall was son of a local merchant, George Randall, and he started whaling, and he went on 4 whaling voyages. His first whaling voyage was in 1848, and then he quit whaling in 1861, and at the opening of the Civil War, and he, like 263 other men from New Bedford, joined the Navy, and many of those men were whalemen, and so we were going to be exploring them as well. But in the course of this research, I came across this really fantastic column written by this guy, Gordon Calhoun. And I said, whoa, this is great. I wonder if Gordon Calhoun's still alive. And so I'm doing this work, and it's like, sure enough, he is alive. And he answered his phone, and it was great. So I think I'm not going to write this chapter for this book and this exhibition on Brave Randall, because Gordon Calhoun's already done it. And so the hope is that when this book comes out, Gordon's going to have a significant chunk of the chapter. He's going to have the chapter on Brave Randall. So welcome, Gordon.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for everyone attending. Let me get the presentation up here. Yes. Okay, I think we're good. As Michael said, I work for the Navy History and Heritage Command, specifically the National Museum of the United States Navy. The Navy History and Heritage Command, for those of you not familiar with it, is the Navy's official history agency. We run 10 museums. We're in charge of the maintenance of the USS Constitution and the submarine Nautilus. Those are the only 2 historic ships we're directly responsible for. We do work with the other historic ships, but the ones we are directly responsible for are the Constitution and the Nautilus. And we also, where I work in Washington, D.C., we have a histories division, and then on one of my favorite parts outside the museum system is the underwater archaeology division, which is in charge of keeping track of all the different U.S. Navy shipwrecks and Confederate shipwrecks throughout the world. But today we're going to be talking about, let's see if we can get to the next slide, this guy, William Pritchard Randall of the USS Cumberland. And I always use the slogan, "His record lives," and you'll see at the very end why I use that as a perfect slogan. And here is the optimistic. There are 2 photographs of Randall, which stand in stark contrast to each other. This is one of them before he joins the Navy. He is a optimistic, very optimistic gentleman. There's even a slight smile to it, very confident. Later on, that's going to change. He's actually going to produce what I believe is one of the most honest pictures that you will ever see in a 19th century photograph. Generally, you don't get a lot of emotion with 19th century photographs because of the technology. He produces it. But as Michael mentioned, he was he was a veteran whale, veteran of the whale ship industry. These are the 4 different ships that he did serve on. He started out just as a ship's boy. His feats were legendary in terms of the local New Bedford community. He claims himself to have gone everywhere from north of the Arctic Circle out to the South Pacific. In one case, he had to shoot one of his while on the hunt in the whale boat. He had to shoot one of his own sailors because the sailor lost his nerve when the mothership went over the horizon and couldn't be seen, and all they saw was the whale and the entire blank ocean. This particular sailor lost his nerve. Randall tried to calm him down and ended up shooting him. In that same particular voyage, Randall broke his hand when he went to deliver the final killing blow to the whale. The boat got jarred, and his tool hit the top of his hand and fractured his hand in the process. But they eventually did get the kill and brought the whale back. But he always would tell that he got his first injury before he ever actually joined, his first combat injury before he joined the Navy. But you can see with the last ship, the Joshua Bradigan, he served there for 4 years in 1861. And a certain event happened in 1861 where the U.S. Navy went to fight the Confederacy in the American Civil War. Now, Lincoln put out this blockade proclamation, and one of the most ambitious and probably underappreciated efforts that a Navy has ever done, any world Navy has ever done. And that is blockade every single port from Norfolk, Virginia, all the way around the coast of Florida, all the way to Brownsville, Texas, to keep out any kind of imported goods weapons in particular, coming from Britain, France, and other places. And this required the Navy to go from about 60 ships to eventually about 600 ships. And what they were in desperate need of is not only did they need enlisted sailors to man all these new ships, that they were building the ships was not the problem. The shipyards in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia could turn out ships long before the mass-produced ships of World War II. In 1861, they were able to construct, I wanted to say off the top of my head, about 40 or 50 ships within 12 months. Pretty good ships too, not the best of quality. Some of what they call the 90-day gunboats. They used green wood, but they were well designed for the purpose of just getting a ship out there in front of a blockade. So what you also need is and this is harder to find than enlisted sailors, is you need experienced junior officers to know how to do all the little detailed things of running a ship. This is something that visitors to New Bedford Whaling Museum, and certainly don't to our museum, that to operate a ship, even a sailing ship, requires a lot of little details, so nothing goes wrong. And finding experienced people who know how to do all those little details is incredibly hard to find. So the Navy did put out a program, the first of its type, to accept officers who had experience in the civilian merchant fleet to join the U.S. Navy. They gave them a different ranking system. They did restrict them to what their ranks were. You'll see a lot of on this list here. These are all the ones, at least that I have found, that enlisted in the New Bedford Naval Rendezvous. The Navy knew where to look. They didn't bother telling people, if you want to join the Navy in the Civil War, go to Boston. No, they brought their tables and their recruiters straight to New Bedford and said, we're going to sign you people up right here and now. No. And so this is from the National Archives in 1862, the enlistment records of New Bedford, Massachusetts, for a different project I was working on for Joaquin P. We can talk about him as another time. But these are all the junior officers, the volunteer officers that joined from New Bedford. Michael reminded me, this is George Winslow here, just as an assistant surgeon. He's going to go on to be, as I was just told, a Rear Admiral and Surgeon General of Navy. There are Randall I have him listed as acting volunteer lieutenant. At the time of the Battle of Hampton Roads, is what we're going to be focusing on today. He was simply known as the rank of acting master, despite his experience. So they only had 3 ranks. They had acting master, acting ensign, acting volunteer lieutenant. This was done on purpose. The Naval Academy officers did look down upon these men, unfortunately, even though they had probably more experience at sea than the Naval Academy officers. They did restrict them to their rank and made it pretty clear that once this war is over, you're out, that we don't need you anymore. You'll still be considered a veteran, but you're out of the Navy. And so they never got, they always had the word acting placed to, and had a completely separate ranking system. So Randall immediately joins. He brings all his, the story goes that when he signed up to join the Navy, he brought several endorsements with him, particularly from the insurance companies, that he knew how to pilot a ship and that he was not going to run the ship aground, that he knew what to do in harsh weather, and then probably was not necessary. But Randall was very, from all accounts, a very proud man. He was very proud of his experience at sea and how to handle a ship. And so he brought all this paperwork, and he was immediately assigned to this ship. This is the USS Cumberland. The Cumberland had just put into port in both Boston and in Portsmouth, New Hampshire during the war itself. At the beginning of the war, it was called, right before, actually, let me back up a little bit. Right before the war started, Cumberland was called home from Mexico, was involved in all the burning of the Gosport shipyard debacle in Hampton Roads. And then once that was over, they brought the ship back to Boston and into also in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to refit the ship, to give it a new gun, and to pick up new sailors, and to pick up the new officers. So this is where Randall joins the ship in Boston in 1861. You'll see sometimes Cumberland referred to in Civil War readings. Some authors will refer to the ship as a frigate. Technically, it is not. It was built as a frigate at the Boston Navy Yard in the 1840s. But in the 1850s, they resied the ship. That means it's a French term where they actually converted the ship to a sloop of war. They basically took to simplify it, they took the top deck off, and then gave it a brand new set of guns, gave it all Dahlgren guns, as opposed to the smaller 24-pounders. And they also, and this is something we haven't exactly figured out why, when the ship was in Boston, they gave the Cumberland a Parrott rifle. You'll see some references, if you read about the ship during the Civil War, as a 70-pounder Parrott rifle. There is no such weapon in the Navy's inventory. We're not really sure why they called it that, but that's going to be Randall's gun. Randall's put right to work as, you're going to be in charge of the aft pivot rifles. And so this man who had never probably fired such a piece of heavy artillery, they're now being called upon that you're going to be in charge, not only to fire this gun, you're going to be in charge of the men to load it properly and do it safely and do it accurately. These two drawings of Cumberland as a sloop of war were drawn by the famous combat artist William Waud. The Library of Congress has his complete collection. I strongly advise you want to see some outstanding combat art from the Civil War. Look at the William Waud collection. And William Waud sketched a lot of U.S. Navy ships. And he did 2 of Cumberland while he was in Hampton Roads. And Randall was joined by these gentlemen. This is the command staff of the Cumberland. Up in the upper left-hand corner is William Radford, Commander William Radford. We're still trying to determine whether or not he is any relation to the Chief of Naval Operations later on. In the middle is Lieutenant George Morris. He is the son of Commodore Morris of the Constitution fame. Right there is Lieutenant Selfridge, later Rear Admiral Selfridge. Morris and Selfridge and Radford all went to the U.S. Naval Academy. And at the bottom there is a picture of Rear Admiral Charles O'Neill. He is a fascinating figure in his own right. He joined the crew of the USS Cumberland as a volunteer officer at the age of 18 years old in Boston upon the recommendation of a couple of the other officers. And he later goes on to become a Rear Admiral and design and run the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ordnance during the Spanish-American War. Quite the career to go from being a junior mate aboard a merchant ship to learning how to design 12 and 13-inch guns for battleships. And then on the right there, the lower right there is Charles Haywood. He is the Marine Corps' first flag officer. He was a second lieutenant aboard the Cumberland during the American Civil War. The first battle the Cumberland and Randall are involved in is what's called the Hatteras expedition. This was a attempt and eventually a successful attempt to take out Confederate forts that were guarding the inlets to the Hatteras to Cape Hatteras. To this day, there's not a big city there. The reason for that was that the Confederates were using the Hatteras Inlet area and the Albemarle Sound area as a haven for privateers. And so this was considered this is an easy target. They brought out some of the big guns. They brought out the USS Minnesota. It's a ship in the middle. The USS Wabash is behind, and the Cumberland there is on the far is in the left and in the center. And this was, relatively speaking, an easier expedition compared to some of the later ones the U.S. Navy would have to deal with, namely Charleston and New Orleans and Mobile. And they had captured the fort before the fort surrendered before the Army even landed their troops. But this is the first time the Cumberland can go into really heavy combat into the Civil War. And then she's brought back to Hampton Roads, Virginia. Hampton Roads, Virginia, one of the finer natural harbors in the world. Today, it is the home of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet. And this is the Cumberland. The Cumberland's on the right of the picture, and the USS Congress is on the left. And that's Newport News Point with the U.S. Army's garrison. And this sketch was done on March 7th, 1862, the day before CSS Virginia decides to come out to engage the U.S. Navy squadron. And the first thing I always point out to people is look how flat the water is. The weather could not have been any better for the Confederates or any worse for two ships that need the wind to move. You'll notice that there are no sails unfurled on either the Cumberland or the Congress. The plan was, and there was a plan. This is going to be I'm going to back up here a second. This is the CSS Virginia. This is the Confederate ironclad that was the hope of the Confederacy to try to break the blockade in every single port up and down the southern coastline. Cumberland itself was converted from the USS Merrimack, a steam frigate. They used railroad iron and built 2 inches of armor on the whole side. Railroad iron is some of the hardest iron available, and she was a very formidable warship, and just for coastal purposes. She had about 10 guns, and what she also had was a ram, and that is what these ships were always known as. These ships were always known as ironclad rams. They were going to use their steam propulsion as their main weapon, not necessarily their guns. So when the Virginia comes out on March 8th, 1862, the weather, and everybody is in agreement with this, how they remembered the battle, the weather was absolutely a gorgeous, perfect picture day. It was a sea state of 0. There was no winds. The sun was out. It was completely glassy water. This is glass-like water. So when the Virginia is spotted by watches, by U.S. Navy sailors on March 8th, 1862. This is where the combat station, the action stations were for the Cumberland. You see where Randall's in the back is gun captain of the aft parrot rifle. Haywood's below him, and you also notice there are at least three other, along with Randall, acting masters. Morris is the acting commanding officer. William Radford had been called away to be president of the court-martial board. He was sick into his stomach to witness this battle, and he had to be on shore to just discipline, be part of some stupid court-martial board, not actually in combat. And then Selfridge is going to take over the front part of the Dahlgren guns, which is 5 Dahlgren guns on one side. Another acting master is going to take another group of them, and then Charles Haywood, with our Marine lieutenant, is going to take the back Dahlgren guns. And then Charles O'Neill's down below with the surgeons. And this is the situation as of March 8th, 1862. The Virginia is way down in what is now downtown Norfolk, coming up the Elizabeth River. You'll see in the middle of the picture a small island, that is Craney Island. If you look at maps today, Craney Island is significantly changed. The U.S. Army uses it as a dumping ground for all their dredging. All the Corps of Engineers, anytime they dredge a harbor anywhere on the East Coast, they bring it to Hampton Roads and dump it in this and dump it there. So if you look even on a travel map, you'll see this big square in the middle of the harbor, and that's what Craney Island is today. But even back, and so the U.S. Navy had a plan. You'll see some history say that the Cumberland and the Congress were surprised. They were not surprised by Virginia's presence. They knew the ship was there, more than likely due to a couple escaped slaves who actually saw the plans of the Virginia being built at the Gosport shipyard and told Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles that the Confederates were building an ironclad in Virginia. And so their plan was to take all 5 ships. We can go back here. You have Cumberland, Congress, then you have Minnesota, Roanoke, and St. Lawrence over by the entrance to Hampton Roads. And the plan was any steam frigates like the Minnesota and the Roanoke would come over to help Cumberland and Congress fight and surround the Virginia and just pound the ship to pieces. That was the plan. It was a good plan. Unfortunately, there's no leadership at all. The admiral in charge of the entire squadron was off doing another campaign. A couple of the ship captains were on shore doing court-martial boards. And so there was no organization. So when Virginia came out, every ship kind of did their own thing. And Virginia came straight for the Cumberland. The Confederates had their own intelligence. They actually were more fearful of Cumberland more so than any of the other ships in the squadron because of the Dahlgren guns plus the aft pivot rifle that was on board the ship. They were not particularly afraid of Congress because she still had the older 32-pounder smoothbore guns from like the 1820s. And then they believed they could take out these 2 ships fast enough before the rest of the reinforcements could arrive. So in March, you'll see where Virginia sort of took a hard turn to port there. That is also they had to get around Craney Island and the very shallow tides that surround the island. There were about maybe 4 or 5, the water around Craney Island extends out very far. It's only about 4 or 5 feet of water. And so when they came out into the harbor, they had to go straight first and then take the hard left turn towards Cumberland and Congress. And that is what's called Newport News Point. And all accounts were they just went straight for the Cumberland. They did not stop the fire at them. And they were just going to ram Franklin Buchanan, the captain of the Virginia, made it very clear that he was just going to ram the ship and be done with her. And ram she did. This is the Courier and Ives print of the action. The ramming becomes one of the most popular subjects for artists to make both very scholarly oil paintings of, and also more common prints like what Courier and Ives made their living off of. And because of the symbolism was very powerful. Here's this iron ship with no sails, on steam only, ramming and sinking a wooden ship with no steam power, just sails. And so the iron versus wood symbolism becomes a very powerful symbolism, and it is stuck with us to this day. And the number of prints that are made of the event are countless times. Now, when Cumberland did get rammed, she started to sink, and she did not sink right away. She did take several minutes to sink, and the crew just kept firing. The crew the ship itself becomes a local legend for, despite the fact of how hopeless the situation was, that the ship never struck her colors and still actually did some damage to the ironclad itself. For many years after the war, the Confederate veterans said that Cumberland actually did more damage to their ship than the USS Monitor, much to the anger of the USS Monitor crew and her designer, John Erickson, and said, how could a Cumberland do more damage? Well, they said they did, because Cumberland had more guns. And also there was an account of the Cumberland. Once Virginia had rammed the Cumberland, while she was going down, snapped the ram off of the ironclad. At least that's what the accounts say. I'll just say right now, we are starting to think that event did not happen because the archaeology evidence does not back that up. But at the time, everyone said that's what happened. So who are we? The people that did not try to dispute that. The event becomes so popular that Topps, I always like to share this, Topps trading cards in the 1960s for the 100th anniversary of the Civil War comes out with these absolutely just pop culture outlandish trading cards of various events throughout the Civil War. And they did 2 for the Battle of Hampton Roads, particularly of the Virginia ramming the Cumberland. They had a destructive blow, and then they had this one, very over the top graphic violence, death at sea. They have one of the USS Curator, CSS Alabama, of the Alabama sinking, and sharks are attacking the Confederate sailors as they're coming in, which did not happen, but it makes for great marketing. This is probably the most accurate of all the prints done. And this was actually the artist consulted with a midshipman from the CSS Virginia about what happened. The water is very calm. You see the Cumberland slowly sinking, and the Virginia is in the process of going after her second target, which is the USS Congress. Congress had been after seeing what happened to the Cumberland, a tugboat, the Zouave, took the Congress over to a shallower area, and eventually Virginia pounded Congress to surrender. It gets a little more complicated than that. Did Congress surrender or not? Both sides dispute what happened next. But what we do know is that Virginia fired hot shot at the Congress. The hot shot sets the wood on fire, and Congress is set ablaze and later explodes that night. So there's almost nothing left of Congress in terms of the archaeology evidence. Cumberland, however, you can see it's just very gently sinking. That one ram was enough. Virginia did fire a couple more shots into the ship, but these wooden ships are a lot tougher than we can get credit for. And this is a print that appeared in Battles and Leaders of the Civil War. You'll see this on the internet a lot. This particular print gets used a lot. That is possibly Randall right there in the middle, with his Navy cutlass, inspiring his men to keep firing. The print is a little bit inaccurate because you see several guns on the upper decks, and there are only 2. There was a 10-inch Dahlgren up front, and then Randall's Parrott rifle on the back. But it is accurate in terms of just showing how desperate the situation was, and that they kept firing right till the moment that the ship went down. And then this is another particularly accurate watercolor. And it's shown, it's the most accurate print, in my opinion, of what the ship looked like after she was rammed. This was done about a week after the battle. You can see 2 African-American boys looking at the shipwreck. You can still see the flag flying. And you see that only half the ship is sunk. The rest of it is the masts are still out of the water. In terms of what archaeologists are trying to figure out, what I would love to figure out is, how did the ship end up like that in middle of March? And then today, the ship is 30 feet below the water. You would not, unless you know where you're looking, you would not be able to find the wreck. It's still there, and I'll show you a little bit more evidence of that a little later. Randall, though, there's no rest for the weary, though. These junior officers are still needed. There's a war still going on. Morris and Randall are both put to work immediately after the Cumberland sunk. They're given about 2 days rest, but the war, like I said, the war is still going on. And so Morris is given charge of the gunboat USS Port Royal, on the ship on the left there, on the picture on the left, excuse me. Port Royal is the ship right in the on the far right with the 2 paddle steamers. And then Randall has made his executive officer. That particular print is the Battle of Drury's Bluff, done in May of 1862, when the U.S. Army was attempting to capture Richmond via the Virginia Peninsula. And the U.S. Navy attempted to help. It was sort of a haphazard, not really organized help like they were doing out in the Mississippi River. but the USS Monitor and the other ironclad called the USS Galena participated in this. Then they were attempting to fire up at a Confederate fort that's probably about 70 to 80 feet above the water line. It was right at a river bend. It's an impossible fort to take with just the kind of weapons that they came with. The Army did not particularly cooperate. The U.S. Army could have taken the fort if they had sent troops over. There wasn't a lot of cooperation between the Army and the Navy in the Eastern campaigns. Morris himself is hit in the Morris did not suffer any injuries, at least physical injuries, from the Battle of Hampton Roads. He was shot in the ankle by a Confederate sharpshooter during the Battle of Drury's Bluff. And then after Port Royal, Randall is given his own command. He's given a bark, a sail bark called the USS Pursuit, which was a ship that was captured from the blockade. And then he did service off the coast of Florida, where he did capture a couple of British schooners attempting to run the blockade. And so after the war, it becomes this not striking the flag becomes enters in from the realm of history and military record and goes right into the into lore. What did Morris say? Allegedly, what most accounts say is that Commodore Buchanan of Virginia demanded the Cumberland surrender. And then what people write back is that Morris said back to them, says, never we will sink with our colors, we will never strike. And they're like every famous phrase throughout history, people remember it slightly different. Selfridge writes in his book, you can see what he wrote. The great poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow hears about Cumberland's gallant fight with the Virginia, and he writes a poem about it, as he liked to do back then. Joshua Whitehurst was an African-American boy who served aboard Cumberland, and this is what he remembered: said, "No, damn you, I will never surrender. I'll sink alongside." And so it becomes Morris's legend becomes a legend for not surrendering. Randall, though, had a little bit more detail about it, and Randall, being a very practical person, from what I've read about him, he did not like to embellish. He was a very proud man, but he did not like to embellish things. And this particular phrase really struck me, and I will let you decide whether Randall is being flippant or he's actually being sincere. What Randall remembered was that when Buchanan asked Cumberland to surrender, Morris did not immediately say, "Damn you, I'll never strike." He basically said, "Hold on a second, let me check with some people first." And so Morris goes to Randall, because they're the two officers up on the main deck. And Morris says, you can see what Morris says is, "I don't want to haul down the flag, but the deck is a slaughter." And so Randall's response back to him says, "For Christ's sake, let her go down with colors flying. She can't float 2 minutes longer. She will sink before they give us another broadside." I'll let you decide if he's being flippant or he's being sincere. But it does give us, nonetheless, we do know that Morris goes back, gets this courage not to surrender the ship, which was rare for do. Usually you are perfectly within your rights legally, honor-wise, to surrender a ship if you believe your ship was not capable of fighting anymore. British captains, European captains surrendered over a lot less than what was going on with the USS Cumberland. And so for Randall we find out this story that Randall was the one that gave Morris the courage not to surrender the ship. We have a new twist to the story. Now remember what Randall looked like on the very first slide. He had this very confident look about him. This is Randall shortly after the Battle of Hampton Roads. It is a much more sober look to him. This is one of the more honest photographs I've ever seen of a U.S. Navy or even a U.S. Army officer after a fight. You can see he has aged quite a bit because of combat and stress. He is trying to put a confidence something, not really a smile, but he's trying to put a confident expression on him. But he almost has this look of just get the photograph over with. I want to be done with this. The legacy of the Cumberland becomes controversial. Now, it is not helped by the fact that Morris dies in the 1870s. He dies shortly after, just about 8 years after the war ends, he possibly committed suicide, possibly due to a morphine overdose. His letters are in Kentucky of all places, and what few letters I have found about Morris, that he was mentally not well. The Battle of Hampton Roads and the continuous combat that he had to do for the rest of the Civil War, he did not come out of the war very well, and eventually goes to a spa in the Shenandoah Valley, Virginia, in the 1870s, where he dies. And so this leaves Selfridge and Randall to lead the legacy of the Cumberland. Selfridge, I do not think very highly of. I think he's a very pompous man from his writings. There's some people who absolutely love Selfridge. I am not one of them. And he and Randall are writing back and forth, along with one of the surgeons of the Cumberland, about how are we going to preserve the legacy. The 1870s, you do not see a lot of memoirs written by Civil War veterans, and that's why this becomes a problem because of Morris's death. You'll see a lot of the Civil War veterans write their memoirs in the 1880s. Both sides, both the Confederates and the Union, both the U.S. Navy and the Confederate Navy, and the Confederate Army and U.S. Army. So it's not until the 1880s, and the most important of those, at least for historians, was the Battles and Leaders of the Civil War series, where Century Magazine put this call out to any veteran wants to write down what happened in the war. We want to publish it, and this series is critical to some of the most honest and frank writings about what happened in certain battles. Some are of dispute. They're not 100% accurate. And that's what historians have a job, is to try to interpret what's real, what's not. But Randall and Selfridge start talking to each other of, hey, Century Magazine wants our memoirs. What do they want? They specifically want us to write something out about the Battle of Hampton Roads. And eventually, and they get into a real heated discussion about this, that Randall wants to sit everybody down that was a survivor of the Cumberland, and so they all can talk about it together. Selfridge is like, no, I am the senior officer that has survived. I'm going to write it myself. That's that. Selfridge does not end up writing for the series. He ends up writing for Cosmopolitan magazine, and you'll see his article there. And that eventually, that article turns into his memoir, which is published a much later on. And Randall doesn't write anything. Nobody writes anything from the Cumberland. The Battles and Leaders of the Civil War series goes on without any input from the USS Cumberland, and Randall goes in sort of a very protective mode of his own. He does not want to really talk about the battle, though he has a lot to say. He doesn't really want to talk about it, and eventually he sees what Selfridge writes. He is very annoyed, dare I say, even angered by it, because he believes Selfridge got it wrong and really dishonored the whole crew, and Morris in particular. So he tells a newspaper, the local New Bedford newspaper, I will tell you what happened at the Battle of Hampton Roads on the condition that you cannot reprint it until after I die. Well, Randall's not going to die until 1904. And by that point, the Battle of Hampton Roads' history is settled in concrete, and I don't want to say nobody cares, but nobody wants to revisit it. And so when Randall does die in 1904, his account of the battle, where particularly how the flag was, the reason for the flag staying up was not revised. Everyone just assumed Morris was brave and sure of himself, even though it was a bit more complicated. And that was that. And we're in the process. One of my goals is to try to correct it, that to show the Cumberland's company was a bit more human, like all combat veterans. That this is the combat, and this is sort of a cliche to say, but it's something worth reiterating. That combat is a very dangerous and horrifying thing, and for us to say that these men aren't affected by it is just wrong. And so that's what Randall really wanted to do. Some of his other letters from that combat, though, are very graphic about men being cut in half, and that some of the sailors wanted to surrender the ship. And that Randall actually gave his service revolver over to one of the leading petty officers, saying, if anybody tries to strike the flag, shoot them. And so it presents a much more complicated picture than what even modern historians to this day have seen. Some of my fellow historians have who write about the Battle of Hampton Roads just gloss over the event and not really go into how complicated and, dare I say, how human the event was. But when Randall was asked by the newspaper reporter who was the true hero of the Cumberland, and he just said, all hands, everyone aboard her. And that's his gravestone at the cemetery there in New Bedford. I find that what he had written on his gravestone to be very telling. He said his record lives, as I almost like to think he's taking a shot right at later Rear Admiral Selfridge, that his record was correct and what Selfridge said was not correct. And that's all I have. These are the, I promise you this, these are the two pictures of what Cumberland looks like today. These were done about 10 years ago, actually, but the ship probably more or less looks about the same. Navy History and Heritage Commands, along with NOAA, we have done several surveys of the Cumberland to make sure that no one's looting it. The ship was looted in the 1990s. The FBI did get involved with that. And we like to tell people that all U.S. Navy shipwrecks and Confederate shipwrecks are protected by federal law. The U.S. government has placed a claim on all its wrecks. This is not Titanic. And that if you touch one of them, FBI will come after you. In the case of the Cumberland, it was the first time the FBI did come after somebody for looting a U.S. Navy shipwreck. There are no plans to raise the wreck. We considered it a war grave. 120 dead, 120 sailors are still aboard Cumberland, along with the chaplain of the Cumberland, the first chaplain ever to be killed in combat. And it would be only the first one until Pearl Harbor. But we do have some of the artifacts that the FBI did recover from the looters. And there are a few others that were taken as souvenirs around the 1870s. And we hopefully will get, and some of them are on display at the Hampton Roads Naval Museum in Norfolk. They are the custodian of all of the artifacts that have been brought up. And if you're ever in Norfolk and visiting the battleship Wisconsin, I strongly recommend you go see it. Thank you very much for having me.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Could you go into a little bit about what really got you going down this road with Randall? I find that a fascinating story.
There is a gentleman who has a Randall's service revolver. He's an antique gun restorer, and he was also allowed to. He also acquired Randall's letter book, and I got to see a few pages out of Randall's letter book. And Randall kept very detailed notes about back and forth conversations. And there's some of the most detailed accounts of the battle. Randall was willing to. He goes back and forth in that how he wants everyone to know Randall wanted everybody to know the accurate account of the Battle of Hampton Roads, but he didn't want to go public with it. And that is just like, I mean, some of the officers didn't even want to talk about the battle. Charles O'Neill, later Rear Admiral Charles O'Neill, he mentions the Battle of Hampton Roads a little bit, just a tiny bit, and that's it. The man is a Rear Admiral, head of the Bureau of Ordnance, never talks about the Cumberland in any great detail. None of the surgeons do. Selfridge writes his own account, and that becomes the account of record. But and it's possible Randall just didn't want to get involved. There were a lot of hurt feelings. No, the most famous being Lee, or are you a Robert E. Lee guy, or are you a Longstreet guy? Who lost the Battle of Gettysburg? And those those type of fights became really, really personal among veterans. And it's possible Randall just didn't want to stir that up. He did mention to one person that he didn't want to be the dog in the manger. He didn't for example, the manger of Christ, that he didn't want to be this dog coming up to this moment and start barking and causing trouble on purpose. So that's why he waited so long. He actually found out that the reporter leaked a couple pieces of information from the interview, and Randall scolded the reporter like, I told you to wait till I died. But that's how I came down it. And the Cumberland itself is a ship that really needs to be talked about more. She had a 20-year service before even the Battle of Hampton Roads happened. Though the Battle of Hampton Roads, we talk about the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia almost exclusively. There were several other ships involved in this battle, and it only does a great service to those veterans to talk about those as well.
Well, that's fantastic. I tell you, we got three, at least four. We have four questions here, and I'll read them off to you in the order that they came in. So Bob Demench is curious to know, how fast did the ironclad travel when it rammed a ship?
Virginia had bad engines. The Merrimack was underwater when the Confederates raised her out of the water, so it had some salt in it. And I want to say it was only going probably about 6 knots at most. The engineer's account of the CSS Virginia is one of the accounts of the Battle of Hampton Roads you will find in Battles and Leaders. And it's a typical engineer's account. He is constantly, if any of you have been engineers aboard ships, engineers are constantly fighting with the line officers above them. The line officer wants them to do this, this, and this, and the engineer's like, "I'll try." And the Buchanan of the commanding officer of the Virginia said, "We're going to ram the Cumberland. Can the engines take it?" And then the engineer was like, "Are you kidding me? No, of course they're not going to take." He didn't think they could take it, and he was actually quite surprised that they lived. But yeah, you got about 5 or 6 knots. The ram. By the engineer's account, the Virginia's engineer account, the ram allegedly snapped off inside the Cumberland, and there have been treasure hunters galore saying, to this day, saying, "Where's the ram of the Cumberland? Are you gonna retrieve it?" We don't think the ram is on the Cumberland. We've done magnetic sweeps of the ship, and there are no heavy hits of magnetic signatures on the wreck, particularly where the ship got rammed. All the guns of the Cumberland were taken off in the 1870s, so we know none of the guns are on the ship, but there's no magnetic hit where it should be, where the ram should be.
Interesting. Well, thanks, Gordon. That's helpful. Okay, so Wesley Schwenk says, Gordon, do you have any idea of what Randall did in civilian life following the Civil War service? I could say one thing is that in the Old Dartmouth Historical Society dedicated the Gosnold Monument on Cuttyhunk, he was there.
Okay.
He was a listed participant in the dedication of the Gosnold Monument on Cuttyhunk.
He wanted to keep serving in the Navy. What he wanted to do. Remember what I said about how all the acting officers were just going to be kicked out of the Navy as soon as the war was over? Well, he was one of them. And so he fought hard, and I mean hard, to get an actual active duty commission. He was willing to go back to being an ensign, so long as you get a permanent commission. And he almost didn't get it because of he suffered a series of several minor injuries throughout the war. And the Navy surgeons were like, "I don't know. I don't think he can serve. I think he'll fail the sea duty screenings." And Randall's like, no, I can serve, really. I don't know if was there a major depression of civilian merchant ships after the war? I think, he did not want to return to civilian merchant marine life. He wanted to stay in the U.S. Navy. He eventually does win. He wins his case and eventually retires as a commander. He gets what the Navy calls a tombstone promotion. He was a lieutenant commander, and through an act of Congress, he is promoted to commander to the retired list. So he stays. He actually that one picture I showed. That's his picture as a commander, and he was and he wanted to serve aboard ships later in life. He was not allowed to, partially because there weren't enough ships. The 1870s, 1880s were very sort of dark times for the U.S. Navy. But he wanted to go and find the Greeley expedition. This is the expedition to try to go find the North Pole. They got lost somewhere around Greenland, and the U.S. Navy was an active participant in trying to save these men. Randall wanted to go on the ship. They said, "We need younger men to do this," but since Randall had been one of the few people to actually go north of the Arctic Circle when he was on whale ships. He actually served as an advisor for what icebergs were like and what the polar ice pack was like. And so he did help out with that. Eventually they did successfully save some of the men from that expedition.
Thank you. Now this gets back to this earlier question that we emailed about a couple of days back. Nathan Pierce says that he's walking around in Rural Cemetery in New Bedford, and there's a stone there for John A. Pierce, and the stone indicates he died on the USS Cumberland in March of 1862. Are there any other New Bedford citizens in the battle? And I think we did turn up some, didn't we?
You did turn up some, yeah. And I was looking through, there's some very good histories written by, I think, like the Massachusetts Veterans Department, tried to list all of the people who served, who at least survived. They have a list of survivors. I don't know about who died. Part of the problem is for the Cumberland's deck logs, they're all down at the bottom of Hampton Roads. The muster rolls, the deck logs, all that. The last deck log I have for the Cumberland's 1859, when she came back from Africa. And unfortunately, the rest of it is, I don't have the rest of it. I've been trying to piece together who has served on the ship. So I don't know per se. That's interesting that someone actually made it back. If they actually died on the Cumberland, they're buried in Massachusetts. There is a mass grave of both Cumberland and Congress sailors in the Portsmouth Naval Hospital Cemetery in Portsmouth, Virginia. They just have this one, they don't name the sailors, they just have this one big green patch and it says Cumberland and Congress sailors. So when after the battle, the Confederates did fish bodies out of the water and then buried them at the Portsmouth Naval Hospital.
Thank you for that. Bruce Stewart asked if William Randall was the captain of the USS Pursuit, as you covered earlier.
Yes,
Yeah.
he was. He was an acting volunteer lieutenant, which was common for many of these ships, but the smaller ships, or shall we say, not as technologically advanced ships. I have a feeling that the academy officers took the more choice assignments, what looked like the more prestigious assignments. Radford would go on to command the USS New Ironsides, which was the most powerful ironclad of the war. It was a ship that took 50 hits from Confederate forts and was able to remain on station. It was called New Ironsides in honor of Old Ironsides from Constitution. It was originally called Ironsides, and someone had a hissy fit that was the nickname of the Constitution. So the Hampton Roads Naval Museum has an artifact from the USS New Ironsides that doesn't have the word new in it. So somebody actually said, fine, we'll go back, we'll change the name to New. There, you happy?
In particular, the Navy in particular about this stuff.
Yeah.
A lot of pride and honor involved. Yeah. Nathan has one more question. I think this will be our last question for the evening. The USS Minnesota did not engage as quickly as it had run aground. Is that true? Is this correct? And would its rifled cannon have penetrated the armor of the Virginia?
It did not, and this is something I'm actually working on for a presentation later on this year, is the weather conditions. They were at one of the problems that Cumberland and the rest of the U.S. Navy squadron faced was they were at flood tide, at the height of flood tide, and the water was going out. And so with no wind, Cumberland, we'll start with Cumberland. Cumberland could not move the ship to bring all of her guns to bear on the Virginia. Now with Minnesota, let me go back to that one little map of mine. We see where Minnesota is. Minnesota has to work against that tide coming out. And the commanding officer of the Minnesota remarked about this in his report, that he tried desperately to try to get his ship, his steam frigate, over to where the Cumberland and Congress were to help those two ships. But he, in the process of tacking and going over, he ran aground. He ran the ship very hard aground, what's called right just south of the Virginia Peninsula is a part of Hampton Roads is called the Hampton Flats, which is about maybe 10 feet of water at most. Minnesota and the other big frigates here draw about 22 to 24 feet of water. And so Minnesota ran very hard aground to the point that they couldn't get the ship off of Hampton Flats when Virginia came out for a second sortie and ended up battling the Monitor. That was Monitor's actually orders, was not to beat the Virginia, to defeat the Virginia, was to protect the Minnesota at all costs. The Minnesota was the flagship of the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron, was the pride of the U.S. Navy. And Minnesota, they didn't get off, were not able to clear her for, I think, another week. So that's why Minnesota couldn't get over there. She was stuck. They removed every gun they could. And eventually they decided they couldn't get the ship off. And for the second day of Battle of Hampton Roads, they just loaded up the Minnesota with as many shells as they could and just started firing at the Virginia. Some of the shells actually hit the Monitor too. Oh, and the reason the Roanoke didn't go over there, Roanoke had a cracked shaft. Even though she's a steam frigate, she wasn't going anywhere. She was not one of the Navy's better ships. And the St. Lawrence was supposed to have a tug, the Dragon. It got injured. The tugboat Dragon got injured, so St. Lawrence didn't come over either. So that's the whole plan that they had came up with. Didn't come, never came to the fruition.
Okay, so let's see. I think that's we have a gentleman, Mr. Wyman, who wants to hear more about the Monitor and the Merrimack and the USS Nautilus someday. So I think you have at least one fan, Gordon, and you can you let us know when you're going to do that presentation, and I'm sure that Mr. Wyman will be sure to tune in on that.
And like I said, later on we could do even on Joaquin Pease, who is a Medal of Honor recipient, an African-American sailor who served in New Bedford, came out of the New Bedford recruitment, served on 2 whaling ships, and we have his medal at the museum currently on display. Yeah.
Gordon, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. It's the Local History Guild. We're going to try to get it going every month, and if we don't make it every month, we'll make it when we can make it. So stay tuned and have a nice evening, folks.
Thank you.